It was registered as a chemical production company. A completely unremarkable name, Diba Energy Siba, the kind of corporate listing that wouldn't draw a second glance in any government database anywhere in the world. Sitting on nearly 2,500 acres of land in Iran's Semnan province, north of Tehran, operational for more than a decade before anyone outside a small circle of Iranian officials and intelligence analysts ever knew it existed. Internally, inside Iran's own nuclear establishment, it had a different name entirely, Rangin Kaman, the Rainbow Site, and according to satellite imagery and intelligence analysis that eventually surfaced publicly, its actual purpose had nothing to do with chemical production at all. It was built specifically for a tritium extraction, a radioactive isotope of hydrogen with exactly one significant military application, enhancing the destructive yield of nuclear weapons. This is not a facility Iran ever declared to international inspectors. It's not a site that shows up on any of the officially acknowledged nuclear complexes, Natanz, Fordow, Isfahan, that have dominated coverage of Iran's nuclear program throughout this entire war. It's a facility that operated in complete secrecy for over 10 years, disguised behind a civilian corporate front, before satellite imagery and intelligence analysis finally exposed what was actually happening inside it. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how the Rainbow Site was discovered, why tritium extraction specifically represents such a serious and different category of proliferation concern than uranium enrichment alone, how this discovery connects to a much broader pattern of hidden Iranian nuclear infrastructure that's continued surfacing throughout this entire conflict, and why the most recent satellite evidence suggests Iran may currently be racing to hide or salvage material from facilities everyone assumed had already been fully accounted for. Stay with me for the full breakdown, because understanding what tritium actually does and why its discovery is treated so differently from uranium enrichment sites changes how you should think about the entire nuclear dimension of this war. Quick note on sourcing before we start. Everything here comes from investigative reporting, published by Fox News based on satellite imagery it obtained, cross-referenced against analysis from the National Council of Resistance of Iran, an Iranian opposition organization with a documented track record of exposing hidden Iranian nuclear sites, alongside CSIS satellite imagery analysis and recent Associated Press reporting on continued activity at Iran's known nuclear facilities. I'll be clear throughout about what's independently confirmed through satellite imagery, what comes from a single source organization with its own political interests, and where genuine uncertainty remains. Let's start with why this specific material, tritium, matters so much differently than the uranium stockpile we've covered in previous videos. To understand why the discovery of a dedicated tritium extraction facility represents such a serious escalation in how you should think about Iran's nuclear ambitions, you need to understand what tritium actually does, that uranium enrichment alone doesn't accomplish. Uranium enrichment, the process we've covered extensively in previous videos regarding Iran's 440 kilogram stockpile at 60% purity, is about producing the core fissile material a nuclear weapon actually detonates. Tritium serves an entirely different function. It's used specifically in what's known as a boosted fission design, where a small amount of tritium gas is introduced into the core of a nuclear weapon at the moment of detonation, dramatically increasing the weapon's explosive yield without requiring a larger, heavier, more complex weapon design. Boosting is precisely the kind of technology that separates a crude, unreliable first-generation nuclear device from a considerably more compact, more powerful, more deliverable weapon, exactly the kind of weapon that could actually be mounted on a missile rather than remaining a large, unwieldy device that would be difficult to deploy operationally. That distinction matters enormously for how seriously this specific discovery should be treated. A country pursuing uranium enrichment alone might, in theory, still be years away from producing a genuinely deliverable weapon, even after crossing the technical threshold of weapons-grade material, because the engineering challenge of miniaturizing and weaponizing that material into something that can actually be mounted on a missile and survive the stresses of launch and re-entry is itself a separate, difficult technical hurdle. A country simultaneously developing tritium boosting capability is working on precisely the piece of the puzzle that makes a compact, deliverable weapon possible, suggesting a considerably more advanced and comprehensive weapons program than uranium enrichment activity alone would indicate on its own. It's also worth understanding why tritium specifically is treated as such a distinct and separate proliferation red flag compared to enrichment activity. From a pure verification standpoint, uranium enrichment infrastructure, centrifuge halls, cascades, and the associated support equipment has a fairly well understood physical signature that international inspectors and satellite analysts have decades of experience identifying and characterizing, precisely because uranium enrichment has been the primary focus of non-proliferation monitoring since the earliest days of the nuclear age. Tritium extraction and production infrastructure is considerably less commonly encountered in civilian nuclear contexts, has a different, less familiar physical and industrial signature. and doesn't fall under the same well-established monitoring frameworks that have been built up specifically around uranium and plutonium production over decades of international non-proliferation work. A country building dedicated tritium infrastructure and successfully disguising it as an unrelated civilian chemical company for over a decade demonstrates a level of sophistication in evading exactly the kind of monitoring framework that has otherwise had real success tracking Iran's enrichment activity throughout this entire conflict. I want to pause here for a second, because if breaking down not just the existence of a hidden facility, but the actual underlying nuclear physics that explains why this specific type of facility matters so much more than another enrichment site would, is the kind of technical depth you actually want from war coverage, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now. I track every one of these developments with the same level of grounded technical context, rather than treating every new hidden facility headline as interchangeable with the last one. Let's keep building this out, because how this specific site was actually discovered is a genuinely fascinating story in its own right. Let's talk about how the Rainbow site actually got exposed, because the discovery process tells you something important about the layered, multi-source intelligence work that's been driving nearly every major revelation throughout this entire war. Satellite images obtained by Fox News, dated to early May of last year, show the facility's physical footprint clearly for the first time in a major public report, spanning nearly 2,500 acres in the Ivanaki region of Semnan province, an area not previously associated with any of Iran's officially acknowledged nuclear infrastructure. The report specifically credited the Network Contagion Research Institute with identifying the site's primary function as tritium extraction, connecting the physical satellite evidence to the underlying analysis of what that infrastructure was actually designed to produce. But the deeper investigative work connecting this specific location to Iran's broader weapons program came from the National Council of Resistance of Iran, an opposition organization that has built a specific reputation over more than 2 decades for exposing hidden Iranian nuclear sites before they became publicly acknowledged. It's worth understanding this organization's track record honestly, because it matters for how much weight to give their specific claims. The NCRI was the organization responsible for first publicly exposing Iran's Natanz and Iraq nuclear facilities back in 2002, disclosures that fundamentally reshaped how the international community understood the scope of Iran's nuclear ambitions at the time, and that were later substantially validated by subsequent IAEA inspections and international intelligence assessments. That history gives the organization's subsequent claims about hidden Iranian nuclear infrastructure genuine credibility, even though it's also worth noting plainly that the NCRI is a political opposition organization with its own clear interest in portraying Iran's nuclear program in the most alarming possible terms, meaning its specific claims deserve serious consideration rather than automatic acceptance, and ideally independent verification wherever that's available. It's worth understanding a bit more about how that 2002 disclosure actually played out historically, because it's directly relevant to how much weight this specific organization's claims deserve today. When the NCRI first went public with the existence of the Natanz enrichment facility and the Iraq heavy water production plant, both sites were entirely unknown to international inspectors and represented a genuine intelligence surprise at the time. Those disclosures didn't simply turn out to be roughly accurate in a general sense. They proved specific and detailed enough that subsequent IAEA inspections were able to locate and confirm the exact facilities the organization had named, fundamentally reshaping the entire international community's understanding of how far along Iran's nuclear program actually was at that point. That specific historical precedent is exactly why intelligence agencies and journalists covering Iran's nuclear program have continued taking NCRI disclosures seriously in the decades since, even while maintaining appropriate skepticism, given the organization's clear political motivations as a group actively opposed to Iran's current government. According to the NCRI's own reporting on this specific site, the Rainbow facility falls under a broader Iranian nuclear weapons development program the organization has tracked and named internally, with the facility itself dedicated specifically to the construction and operation of tritium production and extraction infrastructure. Combining the NCRI's specific functional claim with the independently obtained satellite imagery showing a genuine large-scale industrial facility disguised behind an unremarkable chemical company, registration gives you a considerably stronger evidentiary picture than either piece of evidence would provide entirely on its own, following exactly the same layered verification approach we discussed in our previous video covering the coastal fast attack boat hideouts, where satellite imagery combined with independently sourced confirming evidence built a considerably stronger case than any single source alone. Let's talk about the timing of this specific revelation, because it landed at a genuinely significant moment in the broader diplomatic timeline of this war. The Fox News report came just under a week after Iran's own foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, made a direct public statement asserting that Iran, as a founding signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, retains what he described as every right to possess the full nuclear fuel cycle, a statement widely understood as Iran signaling it intended to continue enrichment activity, even in the context of ongoing negotiations with Washington. A fourth round of formal Iran-U.S. nuclear talks was scheduled to take place in Oman the same weekend this revelation became public. That timing tells you something important about how these kinds of intelligence revelations function strategically throughout this entire war, exactly the pattern we've discussed in previous videos regarding how satellite exposures of hidden facilities have repeatedly coincided with critical moments in the broader diplomatic and military timeline. Whether that reflects deliberate strategic timing in when this information gets released publicly, or simply the natural rhythm of ongoing intelligence analysis surfacing new findings independent of the diplomatic calendar. Now, let's connect this specific facility to the broader pattern of hidden Iranian nuclear infrastructure we've covered extensively throughout this entire war. Because the Rainbow site isn't an isolated discovery. It's one node in a considerably larger network of concealed nuclear-adjacent facilities that keeps expanding as satellite and intelligence capabilities continue improving. We've covered Pickaxe Mountain in a previous video, the underground complex near Natanz, buried up to 600 meters beneath granite, roughly 7 to 8 times deeper than Fordow, which Iran claims is a centrifuge assembly plant but has refused to grant international inspectors access to verify. Separately, in March of this year, Iran declared an entirely new underground enrichment facility at its Isfahan nuclear complex to the IAEA, a site IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi himself described as raising, in his own words, many questions, specifically noting that, as of that declaration, inspectors had not yet visited the site and genuinely did not know whether centrifuges had actually been installed there or not, a mystery he characterized as the difference between a genuine operational nuclear facility and what he called an empty hall. Think about what it actually means that the head of the world's primary nuclear watchdog agency was publicly uncertain, as recently as this past March, whether a newly declared Iranian nuclear facility was operational or essentially an elaborate empty shell. That uncertainty itself is deeply revealing about the fundamental limits of even the most sophisticated international verification regime when a country is determined to build faster than inspectors, can access and confirm what's actually happening inside newly constructed facilities. If Iran's fourth known uranium enrichment plant, a facility it voluntarily declared rather than one exposed through satellite intelligence, remained an unverifiable mystery to the IAEA's own Director General months after its declaration, the confidence level anyone should have regarding facilities Iran has never declared at all, like the Rainbow site, should be considerably lower still. It's worth sitting with a specific irony embedded in that comparison for a moment. Isfahan's new enrichment facility is, by definition, the more transparent of the two cases we're discussing here, since Iran actually declared its existence to the IAEA voluntarily, giving inspectors at least a theoretical legal basis to eventually request access and verify its actual status. Grossi's own uncertainty persisted despite the voluntary declaration, purely because Iran hadn't yet permitted an actual physical inspection to occur. The Rainbow site represents the considerably more troubling opposite case, a facility Iran never declared at all, discovered entirely through outside satellite imagery and opposition intelligence work rather than any voluntary disclosure, meaning there was never even a legal or diplomatic mechanism in place that could have prompted the kind of formal access request Grossi was still waiting on for the declared Isfahan facility. If a declared site can remain an empty hall mystery for months, an undeclared site that operated successfully in secret for over a decade represents a fundamentally deeper verification failure. Now, let's turn to what may be the single most alarming and least covered development in this entire nuclear threat of the war, because it's genuinely recent, and it directly connects to the broader pattern of hidden facilities we've just walked through. Satellite images analyzed as tensions have continued rising amid Iran's ongoing domestic crackdown on nationwide protests, a crisis we touched on in a previous video, show renewed activity at 2 Iranian nuclear sites that were already bombed last year by Israel and the United States, activity that analysts believe may represent Tehran attempting to obscure efforts to salvage remaining nuclear material from facilities everyone had assumed were already fully damaged and accounted for. Let's walk through exactly what that satellite evidence actually shows, because the specific details matter considerably for understanding what Iran might actually be doing. At Isfahan, Iran began constructing a new roof over a structure near the facility's northeastern corner, work that satellite imagery confirmed was completed in early January of this year. The exact function of that specific building isn't publicly known with certainty, though it's worth noting the Israeli military stated at the time of its original strikes that operations at Isfahan had specifically targeted sites associated with centrifuge manufacturing, meaning this newly roofed structure sits in exactly the part of the complex most directly tied to Iran's enrichment supply chain. The Israeli military did not respond to press requests for comment regarding this specific new construction, when journalists sought clarification. And separately, at Natanz, satellite imagery confirms Iran has continued digging work at Pickaxe Mountain that we've covered extensively in a previous video, work that first began back in 2023, with the piles of excavated dirt visible in more recent satellite images growing measurably larger over time. Natanz's own electrical system, according to the same reporting, still appears to be destroyed from the earlier strikes, meaning whatever activity Iran is conducting at the broader Natanz complex right now is happening despite the facility's primary power infrastructure remaining non-functional. Itself a detail worth sitting with, since it suggests whatever work is currently underway either doesn't require the kind of power the destroyed electrical system would normally provide, or Iran has found some alternative, likely more limited, power source to sustain at least some activity at the site regardless. Consider what a still destroyed electrical system alongside continued excavation actually implies about the scale and nature of whatever work Iran is prioritizing at Natanz right now. A full industrial-scale enrichment operation, running the kind of centrifuge cascades that made Natanz Iran's primary enrichment facility in the first place, requires substantial, reliable electrical power. Power that satellite imagery confirms simply isn't currently available at the site. That mismatch suggests whatever activity is actually underway right now is more consistent with excavation, salvage, or preparatory construction work than with resuming full-scale enrichment operations at Natanz itself, work that could plausibly continue using portable generators or other limited power sources, without requiring the facility's main electrical grid connection to be restored first. That distinction matters for how urgently any potential response needs to be calibrated, since preparatory or salvage work, however concerning as a long-term trend, represents a meaningfully different immediate threat level than a fully restored operational enrichment cascade would. Think about why building a new roof over a specific structure, rather than any more dramatic or visible construction activity, would be exactly the kind of move Iran might make if the actual goal is salvaging or protecting existing material, rather than building new enrichment capacity from scratch. A new roof doesn't require the same scale of new construction, new equipment installation, or new personnel movement that building an entirely new enrichment hall would demand, all of which would be considerably easier for satellite monitoring to detect and characterize with confidence. A roof primarily serves to shield whatever activity happens beneath it from the exact kind of overhead satellite observation that's been responsible for exposing nearly every hidden Iranian nuclear development throughout this entire war, suggesting a deliberate, relatively low visibility effort, specifically aimed at concealing activity from precisely the kind of satellite-based intelligence gathering we've discussed extensively throughout our coverage of this conflict. This connects directly to something genuinely significant happening at the diplomatic and legal level of this conflict, because the context surrounding this renewed activity has shifted considerably since the earlier phases of this war. According to CSIS analysis of the broader trajectory of Iran's nuclear posture, the original nuclear agreement framework is now considered definitively over, and Iran has expelled international inspectors entirely. Developments the analysis describes as genuinely troubling signs for the future of Iran's nuclear program. That expulsion matters enormously for understanding everything we've discussed throughout this video, because it means whatever activity satellite imagery is currently detecting at Isfahan, at Natanz, and at any facility like the Rainbow site that's never been declared at all, is happening with essentially zero independent on-the-ground verification available. Satellite imagery can show construction, can show new roofing, can show excavation piles growing larger over time. It cannot, on its own, definitively confirm what's actually happening beneath that roof or inside that excavation, the exact same fundamental limitation Director General Grossi acknowledged regarding the Isfahan enrichment facility's empty hall uncertainty, except now applied across Iran's entire nuclear program simultaneously, with no international inspectors present anywhere to help resolve that uncertainty through direct access. The same CSIS analysis notes that Iran likely still possesses that stockpile of roughly 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium we've covered extensively in a previous video, and that it remains genuinely unclear how quickly Iran could begin actual enrichment activity at this third declared facility at Isfahan specifically. Importantly, the analysis also notes there remain real technical and social challenges that would impede any Iranian attempt to make a rapid, decisive sprint toward an actual completed weapon. A genuinely important balancing consideration against the more alarming individual developments we've walked throughout this video. Having a hidden tritium facility, an unverified enrichment site, and continued digging at a deeply buried mountain complex doesn't automatically mean Iran is weeks or months away from an operational weapon. The engineering, materials, and logistical challenges of actually assembling all of these individual pieces into a functioning, deliverable weapon remain genuinely significant, regardless of how alarming each individual piece looks in isolation. It's worth taking that social challenges framing seriously rather than treating it as a minor footnote, because it points to something genuinely important beyond the purely technical engineering questions. A weapons program doesn't advance purely on the strength of physical infrastructure and material stockpiles. It also depends on functioning institutional coordination, retained technical expertise among scientists and engineers who haven't been killed or driven into hiding by the kind of decapitation strikes we discussed in a previous video, and enough internal political stability to actually execute a complex, multi-year weaponization program successfully. Iran's ongoing domestic unrest, the executions and protests we've touched on in earlier coverage, and the broader strain this entire war has placed on the regime's institutional capacity all represent genuine friction against any theoretical rapid weapons sprint, separate entirely from the purely physical and technical questions surrounding facilities like the Rainbow Site. A regime managing active civil unrest at home alongside sustained military pressure from abroad faces real institutional constraints on its ability to coordinate the kind of complex, sustained, secretive program a genuine weapons breakout would require, regardless of how advanced any individual piece of its nuclear infrastructure has become. Let's talk about why this specific combination of developments, taken together rather than viewed as isolated headlines, represents such a genuinely important shift in how you should think about the trajectory of Iran's nuclear program going forward. Individually, a hidden tritium facility raises boosting capability concerns. An unverified new enrichment site raises capacity concerns. Continued digging at an extremely deep hardened mountain facility raises survivability concerns. Exactly the kind of survivability we discussed in detail in our previous video covering Pickaxe Mountain's depth compared to Fordow. New roofing over a centrifuge manufacturing adjacent structure at a previously bombed facility raises salvage and concealment concerns. None of these four developments, viewed entirely in isolation, would necessarily represent a dramatic escalation on its own. Viewed together, as a single coordinated pattern unfolding across multiple sites simultaneously, in the complete absence of international inspector access following Iran's expulsion of the IAEA, they paint a picture of a nuclear program that isn't simply continuing to exist despite the damage this war has inflicted on it, but one that may be actively working to preserve, protect, and potentially rebuild toward weapons-relevant capability across every dimension simultaneously, from raw fissile material to boosting technology to hardened survival infrastructure to eventually house all of it. There's a useful way to think about why analyzing these four threads together, rather than each in isolation, actually changes the overall assessment so significantly. A nuclear weapons program genuinely requires multiple separate technical components to come together successfully. Sufficient fissile material, weapon design and boosting expertise, a survival location to actually house and protect the finished capability, and the ability to continue that work despite outside pressure and monitoring. A country demonstrating serious, sustained progress on any single one of those four components in isolation might reasonably be assessed as facing a long road before achieving genuine weapons capability. A country demonstrating simultaneous activity across all four components at once, as the evidence walked through in this video suggests, represents a considerably more comprehensive and coordinated effort than any single facility or capability could indicate on its own, which is exactly why connecting these separate threads together, rather than treating each new headline as an isolated story, matters so much for accurately understanding where Iran's nuclear program genuinely stands right now. Let's talk about what this means for the broader strategic calculation facing Washington and Israel going forward, because it connects directly to the ultimatum pattern and the raid versus diplomacy debate we've covered extensively in previous videos regarding both the uranium stockpile extraction question and the Pickaxe Mountain strike threats. A nuclear program that appears to be actively salvaging and concealing material from already struck facilities, while simultaneously continuing construction at facilities that have never been attacked at all, presents a genuinely difficult targeting problem for any military planner. You cannot simply strike the facilities you already know about and consider the threat neutralized, because the same satellite evidence suggesting active salvage work at Natanz and Isfahan implies that even facilities already struck once may still contain material or capability worth continuing to monitor and potentially strike again. You cannot simply wait for complete, verified intelligence before acting, because Iran's expulsion of IAEA inspectors means that kind of verified, on-the-ground confirmation may simply never become available again under the current political circumstances, regardless of how long anyone chooses to wait for it. Let's talk about the human and strategic stakes underlying this entire technical discussion, because a hidden weapons-relevant nuclear infrastructure network operating without any international verification represents a genuinely different category of risk than the conventional military dimensions of this war we've covered extensively in previous videos. Every other threat of this conflict, the naval blockade, the coastal strikes, the power grid campaign, the ultimatums over Hormuz, However serious and consequential each of those has been, ultimately concerns conventional military and economic pressure with outcomes that, while severe, remain within a recognizable category of a wartime consequence. A nuclear weapons program advancing in the near total absence of independent verification represents something categorically different, a risk that extends well beyond this specific war's immediate battlefield and into the kind of global proliferation and deterrence questions that outlast any individual conflict's eventual resolution, regardless of how that resolution ultimately comes about. So where does this actually leave us in terms of understanding this specific, genuinely complex thread of the war? The Rainbow Site's discovery represents one confirmed example of a nuclear weapons-relevant facility that operated in complete secrecy for over a decade before satellite imagery and opposition intelligence analysis finally exposed its actual purpose, a pattern of hidden infrastructure that extends through Pickaxe Mountain's continued deep excavation, the still unverified new enrichment site at Isfahan, and now, most recently, satellite evidence suggesting active salvage and concealment efforts at facilities everyone had assumed were already fully accounted for following last year's strikes. All of this is unfolding in the complete absence of international inspector access, following Iran's expulsion of IAEA personnel and the effective termination of the broader nuclear agreement framework that once provided at least some verification mechanism, however imperfect, for exactly this kind of activity. Before you go, two things I genuinely appreciate. First, if walking through why tritium specifically matters so differently from uranium enrichment, and how this single facility connects into the much broader pattern of hidden Iranian nuclear infrastructure we've documented across this entire war, gave you a clearer, more complete picture than a single hidden facility discovered headline could provide. Share this with someone trying to actually understand the nuclear dimension of this conflict, rather than just reacting to the latest alarming headline. That's the only way analysis like this reaches people, instead of getting buried under shorter clips that never explain why any specific facility actually matters. Second, I want your take in the comments. Given the complete absence of international inspector access following Iran's expulsion of the IAEA, do you think satellite imagery and intelligence analysis alone can provide enough confidence to justify further military action against sites like these? Or does the genuine uncertainty Director General Grossi himself acknowledged mean any strike decision right now is necessarily being made with incomplete information? Drop your thoughts below. I read every one of them, and if this breakdown delivered real value, hit like so more people trying to understand this specific, genuinely difficult thread of the war get the chance to see it. Let's close with the full picture. The Rainbow Site, disguised for over a decade behind a civilian chemical company registration in Iran's Semnan province, was exposed through satellite imagery combined with intelligence analysis, attributing its actual function to tritium extraction, a technology specifically used to boost the yield of nuclear weapons, rather than produce the core fissile material. Uranium enrichment provides work independently corroborated by the National Council of Resistance of Iran, an opposition organization with a documented, previously validated track record of exposing hidden Iranian nuclear infrastructure going back over 2 decades. This discovery sits within a considerably broader pattern we've documented throughout this war. Pickaxe Mountain's continued deep excavation near Natanz, a still unverified new underground enrichment facility at Isfahan that even the IAEA's own Director General couldn't confirm as operational months after its declaration, and now, most recently, satellite evidence of new roofing and continued digging at facilities already struck last year. Activity analysts believe may represent Iran actively working to salvage and conceal remaining nuclear material rather than simply rebuilding from scratch. All of this is unfolding with essentially zero independent verification available, following Iran's expulsion of international inspectors and the effective collapse of the broader nuclear framework that once provided at least some access, however limited, into exactly this kind of activity. Whether this combination of hidden boosting technology, unverified enrichment capacity, hardened survivable infrastructure, and active salvage efforts across multiple sites simultaneously represents a genuinely imminent weapons threat, or a program facing real technical and logistical constraints that still stand between Iran and an actual deliverable weapon, remains a question that satellite imagery alone, without inspectors on the ground, may simply not be able to answer with full confidence. Stay locked in, because the moment any of these facilities gets struck, inspected, or further exposed, I'll be breaking down exactly what it means with the same level of depth.